Hi, I'm Simon. I'm a person-centered counselor based online or in Oxford, and this video is all about bereavement or loss. Specifically, this video is about theories surrounding grief and loss. And those theories can help normalize our grief and give a sense of control or predictability on how the direction of it might be. They aren't a miracle cure, and grief is still incredibly painful. But my hope in this talk is that although they aren't that cure, they can that we can get a sense of what grief is, of how it affects us, and then see if theory can help us with our grief. We're focused today on bereavement, as in someone has died and we're affected by that death. They may be a relative, a partner, friend, or even a stranger or a celebrity, like only last year when the Queen died. I remember being surprised by my own tears at that loss. We may have had a positive relationship with the deceased or even idolized them, or it may be that we had a negative relationship with them. Maybe they were even abusive. We may feel a sense of relief alongside other complicated feelings. It might be a death that we publicly grieve, or it may be more disenfranchised, unacceptable, maybe unknown by others, say the death of someone we were having an affair with, or if we were grieving a child after an early miscarriage that others didn't know about, or an abortion. So that's the focus. It's on bereavement. But there are other types of loss that some of these theories can be helpful with. The first is if we're coming to terms with our own death, say from a diagnosis of a terminal illness or existential awareness of our own mortality. And for some theories like Kubler Ross, which we'll cover later, this is actually how it's designed. The second is loss in general. And loss is something we can encounter in almost any aspect of our life. And we may grieve in similar styles to how these theories explain. Some examples of loss might include the loss of health, a home, identity, of sobriety, loss of our mental health, a relationship breakdown or a breakup, loss of a friendship group, transitions like leaving school or graduating, changing jobs, an ending of a hobby, or even that sense of loss we might get when a holiday ends. There's a third type of bereavement too, and that involves traumatic responses to witnessing a death, which may or may not be someone we're bereaved by. And this last example of trauma might be very tied to bereavement, but I won't cover it so much within this talk. With trauma, I also want to give some trigger warnings. If this was being run for a group or on a piece of training, I'd say I don't intend for this talk at all to be triggering for you, nor would I ask you to uncomfortably talk about personal stories of bereavements. That being said, just due to the nature of this topic, you might well find yourself as a listener being impacted by some personal losses. Your mind might just be drifting to remember loved ones. And I want to say your safety is paramount. So if in this video, if you do find yourself triggered, please just pause it, have a break, give yourself the space you need to allow yourself to grieve and for your grief to speak to you. My last point is that theories aren't miracles, but they can be helpful, and that's my hope for them. I'm a counsellor. You can find out more about me at www.simonslistening.co.uk, and I'll write a summary of this video with some of the key points and a downloadable handout that can cement the learning. As a counsellor, bereavement comes up quite a lot, alongside other existential issues like death anxiety. I may share a resource, something like this, with a client, but the real aim of the therapeutic work is to be with a client in the pain and overwhelm of their grief. It's to give them space, space to process it, not to spout theory at them. Imagine that you're lost in the middle of the woods. It's getting dark, you can't see. So theories, they're a little bit like getting Google Maps out. Doesn't make it any less dark, any less frightening, but it gives us a sense of direction. Just knowing the direction that we're heading in, that can make us feel a little bit less lost. Let me switch sides. So, as you can see from my lovely PowerPoint presentation, my aim is to start with talking about the reasons why I think theory is important. And after, I plan to move on to talk about some of the symptoms we might be experiencing if we're grieving. The final and bulk of this talk will go on to the theories themselves, and we're going to focus on 6 of them. Okay. Reasons for theories. You might ask yourself what the point in hearing about theory is. So I want to personally step back to 2015, to a time in my life when a close family member had died, and I actually benefited greatly from theory. I remember feeling these strange, intense feelings, things like anger and dissociation, and with that I acted in some pretty unkind ways to other people. It sort of scared me. On top of a loss of a loved one, top of that loss, I felt like I was enduring the loss of my own self, and I didn't know what was going on. Was I going crazy? Was I somehow broken? It all felt just too intense, to be honest, and after an incident at work, I saw a counsellor with Crew's bereavement care. At this stage in my grief, I wasn't ready to actively talk about the pain itself or my loved one, and I remember asking them, what's happening to me? I wanted strategies, I wanted guidance to navigate the loss. I knew I'd somehow been changed, and changed for the worse. I wanted to be fixed because I felt broken. And they mentioned a theory to me, Tonkin's model. At that point, it wasn't so helpful, but it did open a door to other theories. And it was one of the stage-based models that helped me to normalize my experience. You see, dissociation, feeling distant from oneself, it felt scary. I felt like I lacked control. But I learned that numbness is perfectly normal, and most of us will go through this when we're bereaved, just like the anger. Anger's common. So this is my intro. I wanted to say that theories of grief can help us, and at the PowerPoint, if we go around anti-clockwise, theories make sense of strong feelings like the anger I described. They give us a sense of control, for me when I felt out of control. They normalize unexpected experiences that took away a sense of isolation by them being normalized. And they provide reassurance that it's a normal part of a grieving process. Theories can stop us doubting ourselves if we're somehow wrong in how we're grieving. And that self-doubt, it can actually block us from being able to grieve in our way. So in that sense, theory gives us space to grieve. And then finally, theories provide a shared understanding of the grieving process, which can help us to work therapeutically with grief if we're a professional or a friend. It prepares us for being with clients in the midst of their own grief. And with that last point, I'll add a disclaimer. No theory is perfect. It's not an exact science tied to any particular counselling modality either. They each offer different understandings of how grief affects us, and different theories will resonate with different people and at different times. When I talk about the theories, in fact, I'll also mention how my relationship with them has changed in terms of which ones speak to me, and which ones speak to me then and which ones speak to me now. Okay. Our next slide is on some symptoms associated with grief. And I'm again going to go through them anti-clockwise, starting at the top with emotional symptoms. We're grieving. We may well feel out of control with these emotional symptoms, and that can impact on our mental health or be traumatic. Emotional symptoms can include dissociation or numbness, anger or outright rage, panic attacks, deep existential dread, maybe death anxiety, pangs of grief with intense depressive episodes or volatile sobbing, relapsing into old patterns of difficult mental health, maybe visceral trauma responses from physically experiencing the death or decline of a loved one. And all of these big feelings, they likely bubble up. They feel beyond our control to handle, almost as though we've been possessed by our grief for our loved one. A sense of powerlessness with it. As well as feelings, we might find our thoughts. They may feel delusional, magical, or even obsessive. Maybe we keep seeing, hearing, or in other ways sensing the deceased, yet know they can't be there. Fear of going mad, yet their phantom keeps appearing. We might be trying to make deals with gods or practicing magical thinking to only bring them back. Our brain might feel hijacked with incessant thinking about them, which can trigger those intense feelings I mentioned. We might have created a shrine to the person, feel in two minds whether or not that's okay, or what to do with their belongings or photos. Maybe we're experiencing similar symptoms in the body to the person who died, and are overcome with fear of meeting a similar fate. Maybe they had a heart attack and we're experiencing something similar. And in fact, bereaved people are more likely to have those physical ailments post-bereavement. We might also find bodily changes with things like our sleep or our eating patterns. So rocked by the magnitude of grief, we may struggle to do those things that physiologically came so easily before in our routine. We may find our behavior or social interactions have changed. Maybe we're acting in ways we didn't expect, like me with my anger coming out in nastiness at work. We may feel as though our personality is crumbling and be unsure of the person we're becoming. Suddenly our role may have changed. We might have had care responsibilities for the deceased, and now we experience a relief because we don't have them anymore. We could have a lot more free time, but now we don't know how to use it. We may be experiencing a sense of meaninglessness or purposelessness generally in life. Without the deceased, our familial role may have shifted. We were their child, their partner, lover, friend, parent, and now our identity is shifting. And the deceased had tasks that they did, and they can fall on us. We might be inundated, actually, with not just the tasks the deceased did, but all of these tasks around organising the funeral or making arrangements, and that can feel quite overwhelming, especially when our resilience or our capacity to cope with things is diminished after a loss. Things that felt important to us, work, relationships, competitiveness, hobbies, they can all lose significance. There can be a sense of lostness and annoyance around the pettiness and squabbles that before really piqued our interest. The world and the things that matter to it suddenly don't seem so important. We also might be stigmatized for our grieving. There aren't any magical words to make someone feel better. There's no remedy. And out of the awkwardness of being with someone in the dread and despair of their grief, I've heard stories of people crossing the road, going out of their way to avoid conversations with the bereaved. Furthermore, the death-denying nature of our culture can add to that sense of isolation, or it becomes this taboo subject where people don't want to talk about your loved one after the funeral, when in actuality a significant attachment will always have importance to you, especially at anniversaries. All of this together adds to the loneliness and isolation of bereavement, which can permanently shift our identity within society and our relationships. Not to mention the toll that grieving itself can weigh on our social batteries, where introverts may increasingly need to isolate, or extroverts need more connection, yet the world seems to be closing in. Excuse me, just having a drink. So that's what grief is and some symptoms of it. And let's dive into some theories that conceptualize what's happening to us in our journey to process the love that we've lost from somebody. On this slide, you'll see 7 theories with 2 models related to the stages. And attached to it, you'll see the names of the people that started them. So there are many authors who have contributed to each of them at different stages. I'll start with the 2 stage-based models, as with the tasks of mourning. Then we'll look at the dual processing model. And then finally, we'll look at growing around the grief and continuing bonds. I've also included Freud in there, just for reference. His idea of grief work was that we needed to sever our link to the deceased and release the energy we've attached to them, resulting in this great cathartic pain, whereas avoiding that pain can result in this depressive episode called melancholia. Freud was the early theory of grief, and the link around painful grief and an attachment figure are helpful, but it propagates ideas like moving on, getting over it, detachment, and more modern theories don't tend to hold this. Before I get into the theories themselves as well, I also want to recommend the book Bereavement by, copy here if you can see it on the screen, Bereavement, Studies in Grief in Adult Life by Murray Parks and Prigerson, which will expand on these theories and is an excellent overview of grief. The late Colin Murray Parks was also the life president of Cruse Bereavement Care. It's a low-cost counselling service that offers short-term work. And I wanted to thank Cruse as well, because it was training with them back in 2017 that first really introduced me to some of those theories. Okay, we're there. So I'm firstly going to cover the stages models of bereavement and Worden's tasks of mourning. You'll have noticed that a white handout appeared on the PowerPoint, and you can download that as a Word document from my website. That's www.simonslistening.co.uk. Or just follow the link I'll put down in the description, where the slides are also included as photos. If you download that handout, it can just act as a little thing to cement the learning from these theories. So on these stages or tasks, we'll be looking in the box in the top left hand corner of the handout. So just that little square on the top left. The first thing to mention with these 3 different models is that it doesn't have to be rigid or sequential. A person might pass from one stage to another in any order, or may skip stages and move between them at different moments as they process their grief in different environments. There also isn't a time limit or expectation to be at a certain stage, nor should we be forcing another person or ourselves to be at a stage we're not in. Rather, let's see it as a flow that tends to move in that direction, but it's really a very individual process. So, Theory 1. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler Ross's stages of grief. And this is probably the most famous bereavement theory, But what's less well known is that it's not a theory of bereavement. It was born out of research in the 60s with patients who'd been diagnosed with terminal illnesses. So it's not so much about bereavement, but more a model concerning the grief of someone who has found out that they themselves are going to die. It's a more emotion-focused model of processing and doesn't necessarily speak every single client's language. For example, if we were neurodiverse and may experience our emotions differently. But for me, this model was really helpful at the beginning with this powerful sense of rage I was experiencing that kept bubbling up. Kubler Ross's model helped me to realize that my anger was normal and even justified with the loss I've experienced. So let's go through it. Let's go through the stages. And the first of 5 is denial. There might be a numbness or dissociation and depersonalization on this stage, a refusal to believe the medical evidence that the person has died or that we're going to die, trying to carry on as though life is normal almost. The existential angst is massive to process at this point. Separating ourselves from the enormity of it through denial is actually protective from being completely overwhelmed by it. It's also a stage we may find ourselves returning to, questioning if it is real, and then being hit by the reality of the situation. The second stage is anger, and anger is a powerful, motivating emotion that really forces action. It fires us up, it prepares us. The approaching death of ourselves or of people who are significant to us can create a righteous anger of how unfair it is and drive us to try and do something about it or rage at this unjust world. It may also not be anger, it could be other feelings and different strong, active, motivating feelings. Feelings like jealousy, anxiety, dread, fear, or a deep, irritable sensitivity. Like with my own story, the magnitude of our anger can feel unfamiliar or even just scary. Just like the denial stage, our anger or strong feeling stage can be difficult to process or accept. With men, for example, anger can be demonized as being violent or dangerous. And anger around bereavement can feel disconnected to the reality of the situation, which can make it particularly difficult to accept or express. Anger that's difficult to express can also end up being displaced into seemingly irrelevant things. I mentioned an incident at work. I shouted at a customer in a clothing shop because they wanted a cheap t-shirt, and I suddenly viewed them as exploiting foreign children, these foreign children workers that are producing these cheap t-shirts. I'd wrongly displaced that bereavement anger onto an innocent customer and made them the villain exploiter of children. I felt out of control of myself as I shouted at them. And then shortly after those screams, I had this deep sense of remorse and tearfulness. A bereaved person may similarly find themselves triggered by things that wouldn't before bother them, like cues or petty disagreements with a family. The enormity of anger due to a terminal illness or the grief of losing a loved one's too big to process, and it can just begin to trickle out, displaced into little moments that are hard to accept and we can beat ourselves up over. Theories like Kubler Ross's can help us to explain those outbursts and stop the guilt we might feel if we find ourselves becoming angry. The next stage is bargaining. With a terminal illness, this may look like finding alternative remedies, prayer and bargaining with God as we understand them, or more magical thinking such as, if I do this good thing, I will be healed. If I follow this ritual, it will be okay. Or filled with a sense of guilt. I deserve to have cancer because I did this horrible thing, and if I make amends, it will go away. In terms of bereavement, bargaining can reflect the prayer, magical thinking, or striving to end the pain of separation, a longing to get over it, maybe. It might also involve trying to create changes in our lives, a new job, relationship, activity, investing our emotional energy outside of our grief, acknowledging the magnitude of our grief, but also desperately trying to push it away by seeing if something else can fill that hole. Bargaining can give us a sense of hope after acknowledging the loss, and realizing our strong feelings aren't bringing the person back like anger, that bargaining itself can cling on to hope. And in and of itself, it's almost a more active form of denial, and it helps us to know that we have tried everything that is both humanly and spiritually possible to deal with our grief. So after comes this penultimate stage, depression. Here, the hope of surviving or the return of our loved ones gone. There's hopelessness, a sense of giving up. Meaninglessness and purposelessness can ensue with these deep existential dread, pangs of grief, despair, and insatiable tears. Depressive feelings are less active than the feelings in the anger stage, and it can be incredibly isolating and lonely when a striving to escape our grief no longer works. Depression in the face of these huge existential issues of loss also feels quite apt. It's too big, and a sense of powerlessness is huge, it's overwhelming. Depression here is also a stage of grief. I want to distinguish it from clinical depression. And hearing that depression as a stage isn't clinical depression may even be reassuring for people who have gone through clinical depression and fear they may be relapsing. Kubler Ross's final stage is acceptance, and this makes a lot more sense if we are the one who is dying compared to if we're bereaved. Terminal patients may report a sense of peace or completeness, a readiness to die and accept what is happening to them. There's no more fighting, and their death isn't overwhelming. Instead, they experience a sense of readiness. In terms of bereavement, acceptance means the overwhelming feelings are triggered far less often, maybe seeming a bit more in control. The memory of the deceased is likely also more balanced. There could be a reintegration, back into society, and less existential questioning of it. Maybe even that sense of peace. Because Kubler Ross is more of a terminal illness model, though, acceptance doesn't reflect the experience of most bereaved people. Rather than this sense of moving on, I find other models give better language to the later stages of bereavement. Just gonna have another drink. Okay, let's look at another model. Colin Murray Parkes also has a stages model, but his stages are slightly different. The first stage is shock, and that is similar to the feelings of denial described in Kubler Ross's stages. Shock is a disconnection or a numbness, both to our feelings but also in our actions, a sort of going through the motions stage. The shock and disconnect can be especially helpful at this point when there's so much stuff to organize in the first month. It prepares us to survive and to process the hugeness of the loss. I find that the shock, denial, numbness, whatever we want to call it, it can also sometimes be underestimated. And this sort of contributes to a cultural strange belief we have in the West that we should somehow be fine after the funeral, when in reality, we're probably just about leaving that shock stage. It's a real stark contrast, in fact, to Victorian times where you'd be in mourning for a year. You'll change your dress, your curtains would be blacked out. Your world would reflect that you were grieving for a long time. I do digress though, and I apologize for that. So the next stage is separation and pain. And this phase almost combines both the denial and anger that Kubler Ross describes. It's not so much denying the death as it is pining for the deceased and trying to locate them. Processing the reality of a separation, that they're gone. They can't be located, they can't be replaced, the void they've left behind can't be filled. Processing that is accompanied by deep emotional and psychological pain. There's a realization, and that just keeps happening in lots of different areas of life during grief. The stage after this, though, do remember with these stages that we can process them in any order and we might jump between them, but the stage after this is despair. So despair, like Kubler-Ross's depression phase, is full of these much less active emotions than the pain stage. The reality that the person has died and cannot be replaced instead leads to a sense of despondency. Depressive, empty feelings, purposelessness, meaninglessness, and withdrawal often accompany this despair. Metaphors like being lost, alone, afraid, in a dark abyss sort of encapsulate what this feels like. Acceptance again is the next phase. Here we might experience the intensity of the strong feelings or pangs of grief in previous stages diminishing in us. It's not as intense, it's not quite as out of control. Acceptance doesn't mean getting over it, but it does mean being more at peace with it. Other models expand significantly on this stage of acceptance, and here works, for example, continuing bonds and meaning making with the deceased can be particularly helpful. Final stage is on reorganization, which again is marked by less intensity of feelings and a return to a sense of normality or realness. There's an internal reorganization within the self that's been knocked by the reality of the death and no longer feels so foreign. There's also an external reorganization back into society, regaining relationships, purpose, joy, meaning. The bereavement may continue to bring distress, but generally at this stage, the person's world has adapted to the reality of loss without that jarring them. And then the final stages model I'll cover is Worden's tasks of grief. Here there are 4 tasks which the model suggests must be actively worked through during the grieving process. It somewhat mirrors Kubler Ross or Murray Parks's models, as well as linking on to other models we'll cover later, like continuing bonds. A little disclaimer here as well. We need to feel safety and containment in order to process strong emotions. They are called tasks, and they must be actively done, but what I don't want to do is risk us traumatizing ourselves by viewing them as things that we must do before we're ready. It takes time to reach each stage, and it takes time to navigate those tasks. So the first task is to accept the reality of the loss. This reflects moving away from denial, shock, bargaining, etc. And those things might protect us from the loss. We move away from them to recognize that the person has died. It's a logical acceptance, but it's also an emotional one. And that reality keeps hitting in different areas of life as we realize the space left in the absence of the deceased. They have died, and they continue to die, as we continually realize what their death means. The second task is to process the pain of a loss, which involves all those strong previously mentioned active emotions or despondent emotions, an overwhelming pain that feels unmanageable and uncontrollable. The third task is to adjust to a world without the deceased, adjusting to changes in the role they had within the family, the tasks they performed that we're now left with, being in environments that we have memories of them with, but they're no longer there, the loss of them and what the connection provided for us, the intimacy of that, a change in our identity in the face of the loss, building new social structures without them, returning to the world and culture when our world has been existentially shook. This may, for example, mean our returning to work or other commitments. Adjusting can feel a little bit like relearning how to walk. In many ways, adjusting's returning to the known world, yet doing so without the deceased can feel alien, foreign, disturbing. The final stage is finding an enduring connection with the deceased, balanced with the previous task of adjusting to the world without them. This stage is about keeping the connection alive with them and accessible in a way that's meaningful, without it being overwhelming or taking you away from the world. Embodying them, remembering them, finding meaning from your relationship with them. Maybe you hear a song on the radio and the connection of them is reignited. Or maybe you visit the grave at an anniversary and you spend some time with them. It's about connecting. So that was the models that are more sequential with stages. The rest of them are a little bit more process driven. And this next one is called the dual processing model. When I trained with Crew's bereavement care, this was my personal favourite model. And I think it was because it encapsulates so much within it. Contrary to an idea about us moving through discrete phases, the dual processing model talks about oscillating or bouncing between different orientations or states. Bereavement's huge. Grieving's a little bit like being really forced to take on a new identity. If we were to complete the grieving process instantly, our sense of self would be annihilated. And often defense mechanisms like repression get a bit of a bad rep. They're sort of seen as defective, but repression, it's the body's way of protecting itself from being overwhelmed. Without it, we'd be traumatized constantly. And this is sort of what the oscillations between these different orientations do. It helps us to cope when we're bereaved. Many people will describe their grief like waves, and they may feel these intense pangs of grief that then fade. And it might be that their energy returns, they may even feel a sense of normality, and then those waves, that pang of grief hits again. And a dual processing model, it reflects this. It sees the process of grieving as a normal oscillating between a loss and a restoration orientation. Orientations, like I say, happen in waves, and rather than completing one or the other, you oscillate between them like a pendulum. The loss orientation, it's the painful stuff that you typically think of when you think grief. And on the slide, you'll see a number of different things. It doesn't mean that they have to be worked through in an order. It's just different things that happen within loss. So Grief works, that's the painful realizing that the person has died. Intrusions of grief, the overwhelming feelings that can catch us off guard. Breaking bonds, ties, or relocation. That's the change in identity, the loss of role. Processing what the relationship means to us, letting go, so to speak. And denial or avoidance of the restoration changes. Interestingly, this element of loss is not wanting to be in the other orientation, but wanting to stay in the grief as it connects us to the deceased, which doesn't feel compatible with restoration, with moving on. And restoration is what people talk about when they picture this moving on. Restoration is adapting and reintegrating. It's essential. It's part of a grieving process, and it happens alongside the loss orientation. On the slides, it includes things like attending to life changes, doing new things, or maybe even doing old things that feel new because it's done without the deceased. Distractions from grief, and giving ourselves permission to be distracted from it, accepting that it's part of the grieving process. Denial or avoidance of grief, in much the same way that the loss orientation had a desire to not be in restoration, it's natural to not want to be in the agony of loss. And new identities, roles or relationships, and permission for these new things to form without it undermining the significance of the deceased or feeling like a betrayal to them. But both the loss and the restoration are necessary parts of the grieving process. If we get stuck too heavily into restoration, it means we can suppress the pangs of grief, and then they end up bubbling out in more painful maladaptive ways. And if we get stuck too heavily in the loss orientation, it can mean that we're distanced from the world and can't connect back with it. Something I really like about the dual processing model is the permission it gives to flow rather than to grieve the right way. It can also give us a sense of acceptance that we're not bad, nor have we forgotten the deceased if we start those restoration changes. And finally, I like how it explains the confusion or imbalance a person may feel, like there are different conflicting parts of them. Acknowledging we're in one orientation at the moment is also okay. We can sort of say, it'll pass, and I can move back to the other one. I can move back to mourning, or I can move back to restoration. I have another drink. So our final theory slide has two more theories on it. And these are less prescriptive, and they're more about our relationship with the deceased. Firstly, Tonkin's growing around the grief, or the fried egg model. I want you to imagine that you crack an egg into a cold frying pan. All you can see is the yolk, because the white is transparent. You turn on the stove, and as the oil heats up, that transparent outer part of the egg gradually turns white until you can see it. The yolk seemed like it was the whole egg, but now you can see it's only a fraction of it. Dr. Tonkins is a counsellor. She writes about this expectation that grief is this huge, all-consuming thing to begin with, but gradually grief will fade and get smaller as we process and years go on. Instead, her experience from her client work was that grief doesn't do that. It doesn't get smaller, just like the yolk doesn't in a fried egg. Instead, as the heat of grief comes, the person's life grows and expands, but the grief is always there. There's no getting over it. I mentioned in 2015 that I saw a counsellor with Cruz. And this is the model that they shared with me. I was pretty early on in my grief, and for me at this stage, this model was both overwhelming and terrifying. I mean, not only was I experiencing these strong, unwanted feelings, dissociation, and changes to identity, I'd been told it was never going to change, that this was my life now, forever. This morning was different, however. I made the bed, and I remembered a childhood memory of trying to help the deceased to make the bed, my nana. I remember clambering inside the sheets as they were trying to get it over the duvet, thinking I was being helpful, and that hurt a little bit. But it was also nice to be able to go back there and connect with that special person. And that's Tonkin's model. We don't get over it and move on or stop grieving. How could we ever forget our significant attachment figures? Instead of that, life grows around the grief. I've spoken to numerous bereaved people over the years. I've heard people say things like, "I'm scared to move on," or "If I stop crying, I'm afraid I'll forget him." Growing around the grief gives a message of hope. I can feel goosebumps rising up in me. It gives a message of hope that we don't have to move on or forget them. They'll always be significant for us. We don't have to be afraid of them truly disappearing, just as our grief at their loss never goes. Life grows instead. This is also my experience of people who have had bereavements, even a decade ago. Dates such as birthdays, death days, and Christmas will always hold significance. There are still times those pangs of grief will hit us with a good old cry, but over time it feels less overwhelming. Another way to picture this: imagine you threw a bouncy ball horizontally inside a metal box. It would hit the walls of that box dozens of times as it kept bouncing about, and imagine each time it hits the wall, it's like when grief intrudes on us. Over time, I want you to imagine that the bouncy ball of a grief is the same size, it's the same ball. But instead of a box, picture an entire room. You again throw it against the side. The pangs of grief still knock us as the ball hits the wall, but the ball is going to collide against the wall far less often. And that's what growing around the grief is like. The final theory on our slide, and my personal favourite at this moment, is continuing bonds. When a person dies, there can be this expectation that that's it. They cease to be, we lose our connection with them, our relationship with them dies, and that's why we're grieving. That's Freud's idea, painfully severing the attachment. But continuing bonds radically challenge this notion. Instead, our relationship with the deceased continues and changes, even after they've died. There's quite a lot to be said on continuing bonds and our relationship with the deceased. How we can work to build them in an enduring and healthy way that both acknowledges the loss and the restoration orientations previously mentioned. Some aspects of continuing bonds that we can summarize include processing emotional difficulties that we are left with, or unresolved situations or conflicts between us and the deceased, being less overwhelmed by the painful sides of grief or traumatic information surrounding the death, reaching an objective overview of their life, which changes over time as we relate differently to them and find out more about them. How they continue to live in the sense of you relate to them and connect with them. Forgiving them for leaving us, for dying. Sorting through belongings, photos, their life story, in a way that characterizes their life for you as an individual, all the while recognizing others will have a different relationship with the deceased, and experience them differently to you. Creating a place to connect with them, and this might be a memory box, a shrine, or visiting a place such as a grave or significant area for them. Being able to connect with them as you understand it, which could even have a spiritual dimension to it. Talking about the deceased, or sharing memories of them. Meaning making about their life. Meaning making is actually a whole theory in and of itself. Embodying messages from them and recognizing how their life and imprint is alive within you. They're a part of you, they're there. Reviewing your relationship with the deceased and reflecting nostalgically on the journey before and after they died. And passing this memory, this relationship, on to the next generation. And in that sense, keeping them alive. As a counsellor, I spend a fair bit of time talking with people about death or the fear of death. And with that, I often reflect on my own mortality or on the death of people I love most, my wife, my sister, what it might be like if they died. And if I did, I don't know how I'd grieve for them. And this might sound a bit morbid, but I have a plan. It'll be a painful plan, but also a beautiful way to connect with them and build continuing bonds whilst increasingly realizing their absence and the intensity of feelings surrounding their absence in different places. So after they're cremated, I would like to gluttonously eat up 30 Kinder eggs. I'd then put their ashes inside those orange capsules, and I would take them to 30 places that were significant to them, significant to us. It'd be a way to mourn, to connect with them, and also realize the pain of their absence in those 30 special places. Gonna have another drink. So that was it. That's theories of bereavement. We looked at the stage or phase-based models like Kubler Ross, Murray Parks, and Worden. We talked about the dual processing model. And then finally we looked at process-driven models like Tonkin's and continuing bonds. There's a lot of benefit that can come from these theories, and different ones have been helpful personally to me at different times and at different stages of my life and of my grief. I'd really love a nice, tidy little summary that ties everything together and gives a miracle cure for the pains of grief. But honestly, that would be too simple. So instead, I'm going to try and summarize and end with some top tips for grieving. Number 1, there's no correct way to grieve. Everyone's unique. So however you're grieving is fine. Models often also fail to take account of cultural biases, genders, neurodiversity. So I want you to treat all of these models a bit like pick and mix. Just take what's helpful for you in the moment. Number 2, be gentle on yourself. Bereavement's one of the most hardest human experiences you can go through. Give yourself compassion. Know it's normal to feel the intensity of things that you do. 3, allow those strong feelings. It likely doesn't feel containable, overwhelming, but letting go and expressing yourself can bring a sense of relief. Number 4, talk about it. Even years later, find people who you can share memories with, close, supportive friends, or others who knew the deceased. Number 5, keep yourself safe. Protect yourself from being re-traumatized. death, it's the ultimate loss of control. So do what you need to do to be safe. That could mean evaluating your priorities, choosing who it's safe to express yourself around. Number 6, you not going mad. These feelings may feel strange and intense. You may feel numb or dissociative. You might see or talk to a deceased and wonder if you're hallucinating. You keep trying to make deals to bring them back, knowing all the while it's impossible. Your sense of self may be going. It may feel like you're having to completely reinvent yourself, actually. And joy may have vanished from things that were once joyful. You might fear that your mental health is declining. You're relapsing back into depression or anxiety. But this isn't a mental health problem. All of this is common in bereavement. You are not going mad. Number 7, don't worry, you're not going to forget them. Even if you stop crying or stop being in that dark hole, they are a part of you, and their significance won't vanish. Number 8, it's okay to be in restoration, making new friends, relationships, having fun, organising your life, having transitions or a change of circumstances like moving house. Those elements can sometimes feel disrespectful to the deceased, or we're betraying them, but you aren't. Living your life, restoration, that's part of grieving. Number 9, what you are going through is massive. The biggest existential crisis is around death and endings, and you're mourning a loss of a human being who's significant to you. Please acknowledge that. You are not weak or defective for being knocked by it. It's human, natural to grieve the loss that you're going through. Number 10, connect with your loved one. Just because they're dead doesn't mean your relationship is. They're alive in and through you. And you'll keep processing and relating to them over time. That'll change, but your relationship with them will change. It's really okay to find times to connect with them. And then finally, number 11, know when to get support. It could be emotional support, or even just bloody well practical support, help with cooking, I don't know. And that might be with friends, it could be with family, it could also be with professionals or organisations. Cruse Bereavement Care can be found at www.cruse, that's C-R-U-S-E, not like the cruise ship. So www.cruse.org.uk. They have a wealth of resources, as well as providing short-term bereavement support groups, meetings for people who have been bereaved by suicide, and social groups for others who have been bereaved. You could also consider counselling. There are a wealth of experienced bereavement counsellors out there. Or you can contact me. I would love to journey with you, even in the painful stuff that I might find difficult too, but even in the painful stuff, being in that dark place with you, or to venture with you into the magic of continuing bonds, where we talk about your loved one and it's almost like they come alive within the conversation. You can find out more about me on my website, www.simonslistening.co.uk. And within my blogs, you'll see a summary article of the main points from this. I've also stuck up the slides and a link to the handout summarising the theories. You can also follow me on YouTube at Simon's Listening, or on Facebook at Simon's Listening Counselling Services. Liking, sharing and commenting on YouTube videos really helps with the algorithm, and hopefully this talk has helped you and it gets more popular, hopefully it will help somebody else. What I want to say though is that if you do comment, for example, maybe you also have some great tips for helping us to grieve, I want you to bear in mind that comments are out in the public domain. So please keep yourself safe. Recognize your own confidentiality. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you in the next video or blog post. I'm considering actually next writing something about some presenting issues with counselling we might face if we live in Oxford. For something related, you may also want to check out a podcast episode I was on with Hope Therapy and Counselling Services, talking about death anxiety, which can be quite related to this topic. Anyway, thank you again. Thank you for your time, and hopefully theories can help us all with our grief.